Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is the People's Action's Homes Guarantee Campaign Director, Tara Raghuveer. Tara, I want you to start right at the beginning here. Could you first explain what is People's Action?
Sure. So the Homes Guarantee campaign is a campaign that's rooted at People's Action, a national organizing network. The Homes Guarantee organizes with over 50 tenant-led organizations across the country that are building power with tenants in their buildings, on their blocks, across their cities. We're sort of experimenting with a new practice of tenant organizing, tenant unionizing. The basic premise is very simple, that there are more of us than there are them, and that there's strength in numbers. So we're trying all sorts of things all over the country, and that's a little bit about who we are.
Can you explain the inspiration behind the Homes Guarantee campaign? Because you are the director, so what led to this movement?
We live in the richest country in the history of the world, and we believe that we can and we must guarantee that every person in this country has a safe, secure, sustainable, truly and permanently affordable home. And we think that's a relatively simple premise, but it's one that we say is complicated by a conspiracy of the profiteers, people who have convinced us that there's no way to provide housing in this country without thinking first and foremost about profit. And our objective is to actually turn that thinking on its head and start to prioritize housing the people first and foremost, and guaranteeing housing as a public good to everyone in this country who needs it.
I want to talk about some numbers here that I found pretty startling. So Moody's Analytics found that for the first time in 2 decades, the national average rent-to-income ratio reached 30% in the fourth quarter of 2022. This means that most people in the U.S. are considered rent-stressed. When you hear that stat, what's your reaction?
The rent is too damn high, and it's been too damn high for a long time, but more and more people are in more severe pain when it comes to paying their rent check every month. What we have to understand is that there's no county in this country where a minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Not an urban county, not a suburban county, not a rural county. There's no place in this country where a minimum wage can get you a safe, affordable home. And that crisis is playing out in all of our communities across the country. Homelessness is on the rise. People are forced to rent in more and more insecure housing situations. Tenants' rights are being violated right and left. And meanwhile, their landlords are making more profits than ever before. Something's got to give. The market can't continue functioning like it is. And it's about both protecting tenants, but also stabilizing the American economy.
Something that you've said before that stuck out to me, I'll read it to you. You said the rent crisis is a crisis that's really decades in the making. When you think back, I was always taught, you can pick yourself up by the bootstraps, the American dream, white picket fence, you own a home, or at least have a roof over your head. So when did this kind of take a turn? And can you walk us through the decades of this crisis level here?
So it's actually really centuries. I mean, the history of this country is a history of commodified landed housing. It's a history of racist policy across the board, and specifically on issues like housing, that has allowed access to wealth for some and kept others out of access to wealth intentionally. The racial wealth gap has everything to do with the question of who can access loans to own homes and pass on generational wealth in this country. So there's really no recent moment of inflection that we can point to. It really has been decades or even centuries in the making in this country under a system of racial capitalism that's particular to the American economy. And then in recent history, we've seen in the last decade or so, since the last financial crisis, the ways that the crisis played out disproportionately to harm communities of color and poor and working class communities who haven't recovered from the crisis in 2008 and are the people who are most vulnerable in today's market as well.
Yeah, the low housing inventory didn't even fully bounce back from the 2008 crisis to where we are today. But overall, what do you think is the biggest crisis facing housing in this country? Is it the rent crisis?
It's absolutely the rent crisis. There's no question that there's a shortage of housing supply. But to talk about supply alone without asking what kind of supply we need is a mistake, right? There is a desperate shortage of truly affordable housing supply. And by that, I do not mean the federal definition of 30% of someone's income. I do not mean what is defined as fair market rent. I mean housing that regular people who are working regular jobs can actually afford. That is the supply that is most needed in this country. And that brings me back to this question about the rent check. I think that's at the crux of the crisis that we face, because our rents are set not based on the quality or condition of our homes, but based on whatever the market will allow. And the market is controlled by the profiteers who stand to make a profit from that market. So they're extracting every last penny out of poor and working class people in this country and face no regulation. And that's no regulation in a world where the market has also consolidated really significantly in the last decade since the last financial crisis.
Tara, recently I talked to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, and she said her goal is to make housing both accessible and affordable. I also talked to FHA Commissioner Julia Gordon, and she echoed the same message. Where do you think the Biden administration, or how do you think the Biden administration is doing at that?
The Biden administration has taken unprecedented and historic leadership in recognizing the federal government's role in the relationship between landlords and their tenants. I think step number one was getting the federal government to say this power imbalance is wrong and it needs to change, and the federal government has a role to play in that. Now, the next step is getting various components of the federal government to actually act on that promise. The federal government's role is undeniable, especially in a market that's so consolidated now. Landlords' businesses are not relegated to localities or states, right? They're not following state borders to do their business. Many landlords who have the biggest footprint in the market are multi-state corporate landlords or even multinational corporate landlords, and only the federal government can effectively regulate them. Furthermore, the federal government is in business with many of them, right? Through subsidies, tax credits, federal financing, the federal government actually plays a role in enabling the market that we see today, and therefore, again, has a massive role to play in regulating that market and in correcting it in the direction of protecting tenants and correcting for that imbalance of power.
In my conversation with HUD Secretary Fudge, she was very vulnerable and honest and said point blank, housing is a crisis in this country. So what would you like to see the federal government do today?
Housing is absolutely a crisis, and I'm so encouraged to hear the HUD Secretary speaking truth to power about the level of crisis that we face today. The rent is the biggest bill that poor and working class people pay every month, right? The rent is the biggest bill that most people in this country pay every month, and the rent is too damn high. The federal government needs to take leadership on this issue by regulating the market. And one of the most important ways the federal government can do this is through the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is the regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. As the government-sponsored enterprises, these two institutions play a major role in establishing the secondary mortgage market. That's a place where a lot of corporate landlords go to get financing to do their business. But a lot of their financing is received by them on very favorable terms that come with almost no conditions about their behavior as landlords. So we're wanting to see FHFA institute a set of regulations that protects tenants and, importantly, regulates rent.
Did you talk to FHFA Director Sandra Thompson? Because she talked to us, and this is what she said to my colleague. It's more than getting a house, it's staying in the house. So how have talks been with her? Has there been any movement?
Absolutely. We've had 2 meetings with Director Thompson in the last year. The most recent one was just this last March. Every time we meet with her, we're bringing a delegation of tenants who actually live in federally backed properties. And in the last meeting that we did with Director Thompson, we had tenants like Harvey Nash from Kansas City, Missouri, present a case study on his property. And he said, we've investigated this Landmark Realty. And what we found when we study their business and when we study the loans that they get from the federal government, what we find is that their business is predicated on my instability. And what he means by that is that Landmark is in a risky business. They're overfinanced. The only way their business works, the only way it pencils, is if they rely on regular and aggressive rent hikes. So FHFA, in their role as the regulator of Fannie and Freddie, absolutely has a role to play in regulating this type of exploitative behavior in the market and protecting Harvey and tenants like him from that level of risk.
The White House proposed a blueprint for a renter's Bill of Rights back in January to enhance tenant protections and encourage rent affordability. Is that something that you were happy with? Did you think that was enough?
The White House blueprint was a step in the direction of the federal government recognizing its responsibility to intervene in that imbalance of power between landlords and tenants. And materially, nothing changed for tenants like Harvey Nash on the day that that blueprint came out. What it did provide was some foothold for future organizing, including this invitation that the White House made to FHFA to start investigating the role that they could play in protecting tenants by attaching tenant protections as a condition on federal financing.
From everything you're saying, it really sounds like, obviously, that the power is in the hands of the landlords. Do you think we'll ever see a time where the power is put in the hands of the renters?
I know that day will come because something's got to give. The market as it exists today is, first of all, an utter failure, and second of all, completely untenable into the future. By that, I mean, our opponents, when we propose these regulations, will say, if you regulate the market, it'll change everything about the market as we know it today. To that, we say, that's the point. The market today is only serving a select few profiteers who have orchestrated the market that we exist within. It is harming everyone else, right? A story of 500,000 people sleeping on the streets in the richest country in the world is not a story of market success. That's a story of market failure. A story of 12 million people paying over 50% of their income every month in rent is not a story of market success. It's a story of market failure, right? A story of landlords reaping record high profits while tenants are being displaced in every community across this country is not a story of market success. It's a story of market failure. So we are trying to fundamentally change the nature of this market. And we're very encouraged with the early talks that we've had with members of the federal government about what might be possible in the next couple of months.
What would the country look like when and if you fundamentally change the nature of this market? What would be your dream outlook here?
So I'm lucky to get to organize with a local tenant union here in Kansas City, KC Tenants. And I saw part of this dream the other night. We just won a big victory in Kansas City in my neighborhood, a building of refugees and immigrants fought for their homes after facing a mass eviction. And they actually won a historic deal where the city is providing some subsidy for their rent on a set of very strong conditions that will protect their rights as tenants, that will make sure that their rents don't go up and that they can't be evicted at least for the next 2 years. And on Saturday night, we had this gorgeous party where the Burmese tenants brought noodles, the Mexican tenants brought tacos. We listened to Bollywood music and cumbia music, and all of these tenants, the kids, the elders, got to just hang out together and be in community. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about the world as it should be. It's just a place where communities are stable. They have some breathing room. They can plant a garden, take care of their neighbors, send their kids to the same school for years on end. And that is not a radical vision. That is what our communities are owed. That's what our people are owed, especially in the richest country in the history of the world.
So what's next for the Homes Guarantee campaign?
Right now, we're in the process of organizing with groups across the country to submit comments as part of this RFI process that FHFA is launching at the end of this month. So they're basically seeking information on what they could or should do in their role as a regulator and conservator of the enterprises to protect tenants. And we plan to knock on 30,000 doors of tenants who live in federally backed properties all summer and make sure that those tenants have a voice in that comment period that FHFA has launched. we're also planning on taking Director Thompson on a tour of some of these properties across the country that have benefited from some federal financing or refinancing. But we want to make sure that she has a deep understanding of how federal financing has implications for tenants and the types of conditions that tenants are enduring at the hands of some of these corporate landlords.
Can you dive a little deeper into that? What are these conditions that they're enduring? And you're on the ground. What is the reaction from tenants now? And how do they feel about the future?
The conditions are really dire across the country. And again, this all comes back to the rent, right? If a tenant can't afford the rent, they're forced into a desperate situation where they're renting from whomever will take them. And they sort of have to sign a lease regardless of the condition of the place that they go. And oftentimes what I've observed in the years that I've been tenant organizing is that people are left with landlords of last resort. That's what I call them, right? It's landlords who do almost nothing to keep up the property. They keep their expenses extremely low. They know that they're renting to people who are desperate and they can't find another place. And therefore they exploit that desperation, right? They actually make tenants live with mold and with appliances that don't work, and the heat goes out in the winter and the AC goes out in the summer. And they know that they actually don't have to fix that because the tenants are sort of trapped, right? They're sort of captive in the market. And so those are some of the conditions that tenants are facing. When we knock on doors, tenants know that this is wrong, right? They know that the rent is too high. They know that these conditions are horrible. They know that something's got to give. And the encouraging thing, the hopeful thing that we find is that almost every door we knock, when we ask someone, are you ready to do something about this? Their answer is yes. And they join the union and they're ready to take some kind of action with us, especially when we tell them, you know, this property actually benefits from financing that comes in part from the federal government, right? When they hear about the public money that's involved in the private business that their landlord is involved in, they get even more fired up and they're ready to do something.
500,000 people in this country are sleeping on the street, are unhoused. Most people in this country appear to be rent stressed. If this problem gets solved, what other problems do you think would be solved because of that? Would it create this domino effect?
Absolutely. Housing is central to each of our lives. The place where we're able to rest our head at night determines so much about how we get to live, how we show up at our jobs, how our kids show up at schools, what our neighborhoods look and feel like, how our cities do economically and otherwise. You know, solving this problem is at the core of solving for so much of the pain and strife that we experience as a community, as a nation today. And it has those types of positive implications for tenants themselves, but also for the American economy, right? Last summer, we saw historic levels of inflation, and we're still experiencing some of the economic fallout of that inflation crisis today. Potential for recession as well. Rent is was one of the core drivers of overall inflation, right? It was one of the core and most enduring drivers of overall inflation. For too long, housing has been treated as a domestic policy issue. It's sort of been relegated to a third rail that no one wants to touch. The federal government has said it's state and local governments say it's the federal government's responsibility. No one really wants to do anything about it. Today, in 2023, it's undeniable that at every level of government, we need proactivity, we need vision, we need creative solutions. And that's not only good for tenants, that's good for the American economy, and it's good for our country overall.
You mentioned that this is a third rail in politics. But what's interesting is this affects everyone, no matter your party, no matter your age, no matter your race, no matter anything about you, housing affects you. So why is this a third rail?
It comes down to racism and classism. You know, I think there's a much deeper dive into history that I could get into, but I think that's a lot of what it comes down to. That's a lot of the reason that housing has not been touched with a 1,000-foot pole at the federal government level for years and years. And that's starting to change, not necessarily because the political will has shifted so significantly, but because the conditions are so dire, right? We are in an emergency situation, like the HUD secretary said to you, and something has got to give, right? It is untenable that we continue in a world where rents increase 20% year over year in many regions across the country, and tenants' wages have been stagnated for years and years, right? Something's got to give. More and more people are ending up on the streets. This issue has become so high-pitched for so many people. And to your point, this is an issue that crosses every line that our opponents might try to use to divide us, right? It crosses class lines, it crosses race lines, it crosses age lines, it crosses party affiliation. And that should scare our opposition, right? I've organized trailer parks where there are Trump voters and there are Bernie Sanders voters, and there are Black people and there are Mexican people and there are white people. There are people of all class backgrounds, and they may have nothing else in common. But what they have in common is their struggle for a safe and secure home and a safe and secure community. That brings them together, and they, as a force, are unstoppable.
Something you keep saying, the rent is too damn high, and voters across the aisle agree with you there. So what could the federal government do tomorrow in terms of controlling that rent?
Yeah. The president could sign an executive order that directs all kinds of action across the federal government to regulate rent. It is our view that the most material way that the federal government could regulate our rents is through this type of FHFA regulation on federally financed properties. That would apply to millions of units of housing across the country that have been financed in part or in full by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. By instituting regulations like that, FHFA could immediately intervene in the market in a pretty major way. And what Fannie and Freddie will say is, we don't control the market. We're influencers in the market, but we don't control it. But here's the thing. They're major influencers in the market. Between Fannie and Freddie, that's 40% of the multifamily housing market. And where Fannie and Freddie go, the rest of the market follows, right? They're table setters. So if that many units in the market get regulated by some kind of federal policy, that is a major intervention that would improve conditions for tenants across the country and stabilize our communities as well.
Tara Raghuveer, thank you for joining me. It's an important conversation.
Thank you so much. Take care.